Hello and welcome to another episode of So You Have a Podcast made by WXVU Villanova Radio. Today, I have the honor to be joined by Liam and Sam, hosts of the podcast Gladio Free Europe. Guys,
Hello,
how are you doing
hello.
today?
Yeah,
Hey, doing great.
yeah, doing great. Thanks so much for asking us to come on. We just love to talk about ourselves.
And that is what you are here to do. So, what inspired you guys to start Gladio Free Europe?
Uh, I guess I can go first. For me, really, it was podcasting is something that I'd wanted to do for a while, for a couple of years. And it just so happened that it just so happened that I fell in with a group of people, Liam, Sam, and Abram, who were also interested in pursuing this venture. So next thing you know, we're podcasting, and now we're up to episode 66, I think it is. So it's been a while, almost 2 years.
I think kind of more specifically, right at the start of COVID, the four of us, so me, Russian Sam, Sambi, and Abram, we all started having these kind of regular Zooms, just kind of chatting about whatever, just because we were bored, we were all stuck at home, just chatting about history. We were in a history Twitter chat already, and then just somebody had the idea that it would be fun to start doing this as a podcast. I think that we saw a couple movies over Discord and Zoom already, so that's kind of how the movie angle got brought in. And because myself and Abram both have kind of a movie background, and Russian Sam, has a very exciting history background, we thought it would be a pretty cool little mix if we all kind of came together like that.
Yeah. Sam, do you have anything else to add?
I guess I could talk a bit about myself and how I came to this beyond the podcast itself. Like basically, I'd been on an academic track since high school, right? It was just something that I had been hyping myself up for forever. That like, oh, I'm gonna go do my PhD. I'm gonna become a professor, and I'm gonna get to teach people stuff, and it's gonna be great. But then I actually got into grad school, and the conditions just seem to deteriorate further and further. And next thing you know, I finish my master's literally right before COVID starts, and academia is just totally eviscerated. So I guess the long and short of it is that you can say that this is sort of an alternate academic path for me. This is a way to pursue my passion, something that I actually studied without having to worry about being adjunct faculty earning like $20,000 a year or whatever.
Yeah, very interesting. I've heard horror stories from professors or just visiting professors about how difficult it is in academia right now.
It's rough out there. Yeah. And for me, this is always just a hobby. I was a history major in undergrad, but since then I've been mostly in the film world. I've been doing a lot of very low level film and TV development stuff for the last couple of years. So I'm having a lot of fun in that world. But history was always a really big kind of fun hobby of me. For me, it's always something that I a lot of what I engage with on social media is history stuff. So that's kind of it was this kind of nice little marriage of my two main hobbies, cinema and history with this podcast. So
Yeah, and so sort of since we're talking about you guys' more personal background, do you have any historical periods that you are each particularly interested in?
I'll let you
Uh,
go first, Sam.
yeah. Well, I mean, it just happens to be whatever I happen to be researching at the moment, right? Before I was doing the podcast, I should clarify that I was doing Middle Eastern history specifically. And I was honestly kind of myopic about how I went about the study of history, where I uh, just with the rise of like increasing specialization, I just wasn't really pushed to explore other areas nearly as much. And I feel like that was a big mistake, just because it means that you have a very limited perspective. You don't have a great idea of like the wider world and the wider systems, where events are happening. So yeah, now I have a more holistic approach. I'm studying a lot of periods that I didn't really think I'd be interested in before. Currently, I'm looking at the Cult of the Saints, which is, again, something I never thought I'd be interested. But to circle back to my favorite period of history, I still have to say that it would be like the 20th century, just because it's what I'm most familiar with. It's the one that's most relevant to our times, and it's just very, like, it's a time period when you can touch, right? Like, you can still speak to people who lived through many of these events. And that's what really drew me in the first place when I was first starting to get interested in history.
I studied a lot of 20th century stuff as well in undergrad, but I've mostly been interested kind of in the opposite, the stuff that is the least relevant, the stuff that has the least actual political implications for, modern discourse. At least just for like purely aesthetic reasons, I was always most into like the ancient stuff, the medieval stuff, the kind of history that is, I think, a lot more, oftentimes, more exotic and exciting. And I have to admit that my interest in a lot of these areas is a lot of times it's pretty juvenile. It's just because like I find it interesting. But I think that studying history for its own sake is absolutely valid, and I think is sometimes one of the better ways to approach history, especially when you're dealing with events more alienated from the present day. And I think that in general, I kind of hazard against trying to draw too many inferences about the present from the past, because I think that usually that just leads to a misinterpretation of both time periods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you both for your answers. So before we get on to some of the other questions, could you briefly talk about the name Gladio Free Europe? Because I find it very funny, but for our less parapolitically inclined listeners, could you give a little explanation?
I'll say, I think the main reason that this podcast is called Gladio Free Europe is because that was a very funny joke in like early 2020. Gladio takes its name, of course, from Operation Gladio, which is, as you mentioned, is this parapolitical set of stay-behind programs in Cold War era Europe. Basically, what it was that
Gladio specifically Italy. Sorry.
Yes, specifically in Italy, but it's often used kind of as a metonymy for this broader set of programs that may or may not have existed in other countries, most famously in Belgium, in France, and Germany. What it basically is this insane Cold War era plan where the CIA and NATO were giving, in coordination with European governments, we're setting up these basically right-wing militia programs to protect European societies in the event of any kind of Soviet invasion. So basically it meant giving money and guns to neo-Nazis to potentially to fight communism. And I think that the interplay between communism and fascism is something that I've always been very interested in. I think that the specifically anti-communist nature of fascism is something that is sometimes ignored in liberal historiography, or is something that is kind of miffed. And Gladio was something that was being discussed very heavily around like the start of COVID, especially by a lot of other podcasts that we are fans of, and I'm sure you're fans of as well. And so that's kind of the main thing. And also it's a great pun, Radio Free Europe, Gladio Free Europe. And, because, Sam and I, we're all committed anti-fascists. I think that we would all love to live in a Gladio Free Europe and a Gladio Free world more broadly.
Yeah, that's what we're building towards.
All right. It's a great title. Very funny.
Thank you.
Gives me a chuckle every time I read it.
I'm not great. I'm not the best at puns, but I think that is the best one I've ever come up with.
So moving on to more of like the production of Gladio Free Europe, has there been a learning curve in the way you guys approach it? How do you do it differently now than when you started?
Well, let me just say that the learning curve was so steep that our first 3 episodes are now completely inaccessible because they were so bad compared to our later stuff. But I'll let Rush and Sam take this one.
Yeah. In the beginning, when we were just starting, like, we basically had no idea what we were doing, right? Like, we all consume podcasts. We listen to a lot of them, but nevertheless, consuming and producing are two totally different things. There's a lot you have to learn. I have a tendency to just keep rambling on, and it's been a struggle to cut down on that, really. But yeah, we had to be better at organizing our thoughts and to basically structure each episode in a way that like flows naturally and also makes sense to the listener who might be getting exposed to any of this for the first time ever.
And I would say I got to shout out Abram here. Yeah, he's not as directly involved as he used to be because of work commitments, but he was like our Brian Epstein. He really helped us organize ourselves and become a more serious podcasting team. And for a while, he handled all of the production, which is a really huge commitment. Since then, Russian Sam and I have picked up more of the producing slack when it comes to editing, which I'm very fortunate in. I'm so, let me take a step back. I'm so grateful for Abram for doing so much amazing producing work in like the first year this podcast was around. But since I've been taking more editing on myself, I've learned a lot about how to not just how to edit a podcast, but also kind of what goes into like, writing a podcast and producing. It gave me a better and broader perspective of the whole enterprise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Abram is totally indispensable. Big shout out to Abram.
Yeah.
So what is some of the process like? Do you guys have a writer's room where you hash out ideas and then record? Is there a lot of editing usually?
Oh yeah. I think usually we spend about 2 weeks per episode. Usually what it is that we just chat about something that catches our interest, whether it's a movie or just like a story or a certain time period. And then we just kind of, usually what happens is one of us will say, oh, this could be a good idea. And then one of us just kind of, one single person starts working on that document. So we'll be chatting in our group chats. We'll have an idea, maybe a fan will have an idea. We'll look into that. We'll decide it's a good idea for a podcast. And then one person will just start doing all the research. And then once we get closer to the date of recording, usually we might ask, like, if Russian Sam is doing something on his own, I might step in to help with the research or vice versa. And then we are both, especially me, terrible procrastinators. So we tend to do a lot of cramming in the last few days before the podcast is recorded, just figuring out what kind of information do we want to cover in this episode, what is less essential, and then eventually the final writing stage really happens in the editing suite. Once Russian Samurai are actually editing this podcast, sometimes if a certain line is a little bit irrelevant to the broader context, that can be cut and the entire thing goes smoother. And the entire episode is more focused.
All right. So, Sam, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Liam did a great job summarizing it.
Okay. So now moving on to some of the content of your show. What are the limits to presenting historical events in movies that you found through watching a lot of historical movies?
Well, there's a number of problems here, right? I mean, I guess the biggest one right off the bat is the fact that movies are a for-profit product. They're made to make money, and naturally that's going to lend itself to very particular interpretations of history. That I would say is one of the main hurdles. But even beyond that, like with movies, you have a very limited amount of space to cram all of this information into. And that, of course, doesn't lend itself to a lot of nuance. Oftentimes, you're going to be relying upon the audience's preconceptions about a particular period to like basically fill in the blanks so they can like comprehend what they're seeing exactly. And when that foundation isn't the most stable and the most factually informed in the first place, it leads to a lot of problems with how we understand history.
Yeah, totally. And even beyond that, I think that there's a fundamental conflict, which I find very interesting, between the demands of the narrative and the demands of history, basically. And how in a lot of cases, changing the truth, or I shouldn't say changing the truth, in a lot of cases, editorializing or making assumptions about the past feels necessary to tell a good story. And I think it's really a choice of every filmmaker how much is acceptable to stray from the past, to stray from what we know about a certain time or place to tell a more engaging story. And I think there's not a single answer to that. I think it really depends on what kind of history you are telling and what kind of movie you're making. I think that it's incredibly dishonest to stray from the accepted record and then present what you are doing as the single truth, as some historical filmmakers are notorious for doing. But I think that extemporizing or editorializing to in ways that tell a better story, I think sometimes you can get away with that. And a lot of my favorite historical films aren't necessarily incredibly historically accurate, but they're just very fun. Like, come on, A Knight's Tale. Everyone loves that, right? And it's like that's like the medieval movie with the Queen soundtrack. There's nothing remotely historically accurate about it. I think one of the main characters is Edward the Black Prince. Nothing like the actual guy, but it's still a great movie. It's not really a movie about the actual Middle Ages. It's a movie that is about how we might imagine and remember the Middle Ages today. And I think that's more broadly something that really interests me about historical fiction is not what it tells us about the past as it happened, but what it tells us about the past as we remember the past.
Yeah, very thorough answer. Sam, do you have something to add?
No.
Okay. So you kind of both touched on this a little bit, but what do you think separates good historical movies from bad ones?
I mean, in terms of a good movie or good history, because as Liam said,
yeah,
brought to light.
I'm sorry, I cut you off. Ryan, can you repeat that? I cut you off.
Yeah, I guess you could take it like separately. Like what makes a good movie, like in terms of presenting it like historically accurately, which is pretty self-explanatory, and then like a good movie, and then like how do you adjudicate like how much historical accuracy you want to put in versus how much of a compelling narrative you want to put it
in. Sandy, you can go first.
I mean, I guess a good movie is just a good movie, It's you know it when you see it, even if you can't really quantify it. But in terms of the history angle specifically, I would say that a good historical movie is one that doesn't necessarily give you all of the facts, but which describes a wider truth that really captures more of the essence of what living in this period would have been like, even if the events are taking place within a totally like an otherwise totally fictional setting and characters, right? So I'd say that there's a lot of really there's a fair number of high budget movies that look great and are, I guess, historically accurate, but they just don't really hit. And then there are other movies that maybe don't look as great, but which do capture this wider truth, so to speak.
Yeah. I would say it depends on what you're trying to do, what the filmmaker is trying to accomplish. I think that a lot of my favorite historical fiction does embellish heavily, and a lot of your historical fiction does not. And I think it really kind of depends on what is the work of art you're trying to create here. One clever way to do this, I think the most successful example of historical fiction editorializing that I can think of is Wolf Hall, which is a book by Hilary Mantel, which is also a really good miniseries from like 2015, I want to say. It is it's set in the 16th century, and it's about Thomas Cromwell, who was one of the chief advisors to Henry VIII. He was a commoner who was really the only major commoner in the Tudor court at that time, broadly speaking. So he's an interesting guy. And of course, if you recognize his last name, he was the great great uncle of Oliver Cromwell. So he was from a very important family. Hilary Mantel read basically everything available about the Tudor court at this time. And what she was especially interested in were the rumors, things that pop up in one or two books, in letters written between different courtiers that may or may not be true, like whether someone might actually be the king's illegitimate son, whether the princes in the Tower were killed by Richard III or by Henry's father, stuff like that. assumptions and guesses and conspiracy theories from the time that she found interesting and that she thought that she could weave into her narrative in ways that would ultimately add some, some more depth and meaning to the work. So she basically she takes a lot of myths that historians might be skeptical of, but because they were believed at the time and because her characters are living in this time, she presents these myths and rumors as if they were true, which I think is, I think it's a smart thing to do.
Yeah, it's very interesting way to approach it. So you kind of mentioned how you have to you have a lot of like historical like info that seems like alien to modern viewers, but you also have to convey a story that, sells tickets by appealing to a modern audience. Do you
Yeah.
think that there's a tendency to compromise too much in favor of presenting a view of history that is amenable to a modern audience that sacrifices some of the weirdness of history?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. No, that's incredibly common. I think that people living in past societies just had very different values than we happen to have today, and it can be really hard to communicate past values to modern people. Like something you see both these days on social media, especially, and in culture more broadly, is people of like any political bent trying to project their politics onto earlier societies which would not have understood modern political language because they think that will justify their politics. I'm kind of against that for both reasons. Like for instance, people love saying that like Jesus was socialist. I think it's kind of goofy because socialism would have been meaningless to somebody living in first century Roman Empire. But even beyond that, Jesus doesn't have to be a socialist for socialism to be a worthwhile project. I don't think that past historical precedent is necessary to justify or legitimize modern politics. But a lot of people don't get that, and they feel this need to connect their personal beliefs and their personal virtue towards the past. It's like I like The Northman a lot, but the movie The Northman, it drew heavily on a lot of very modern scholarship about the Norse era. Very exciting scholarship that I'm really into. This meant though that people who were interested in a more, I don't know, like Hollywood, a more traditional Viking narrative, some of those guys were really mad about The Northman. And then on the flip side, you had the kind of inverse political controversy where people who were so bothered by the absolutely horrendous misappropriation of Norse history by right-wing racist groups today had an aversion to the Northmen because they feared that any kind of depiction of that era might inadvertently support some kind of reactionary agenda.
So the next question I have is, do you think there are any historical eras that lend themselves more to film than others?
Oh yeah, we were just talking about this with Matt Chrisman the other week. We had him on to talk about The Last Valley, which is one of the only movies made in English about the 30 Years' War.
Yeah.
And I mean, basically, it's just kind of a jarring period, all in all, for a modern audience, just because, like, on the one hand, you have people on horseback, and you have like some vestiges of these courtly values of chivalry and whatnot, but also
Yeah.
you have guns, and people just don't really know what to do with that.
Yeah, and this is why I think the early modern period is so exciting because of all those changes and these kind of contradictions to the modern eye. But yeah, it makes early modern history a bit tricky to depict, especially the later early modern period. Once like modern cannons and artillery were being so heavily used. I think really what it is though is that there are certain genre paradigms that are very familiar to filmmakers. There are certain times and places that give us that are associated with tropes and aesthetics that everyone understands, like the Old West, cowboys, Indians, bank robbers, train heists, yada yada yada, honky tonk piano, Middle Ages, knights, witches, horseback, all that kind of stuff. So there are certain times and places that audiences and filmmakers instinctively understand, but eras that stray from that, people have trouble with wrapping their heads around what life was like then. Just like as a micro example from my own life, a while back I wrote when I was at when I was at film school, I wrote a script that was set in the early 20th century, like 1910-ish, looking at the kind of birth of modern police in California. And that's an era that a lot of people have trouble wrapping their heads around because it's not Victorian. World War I hasn't happened yet. It's still like 20 years off, or it's still a decade off from the Jazz Age. So it's this uncomfortable middle ground where people just are not as familiar with the aesthetics in particular of that era, and also the social values of that era, which I think leads to a lot of eras being unfortunately ignored by historical filmmakers. I think the 30 Years' War is an incredibly rich source of inspiration for storytellers, and that's why it's a shame that the only English language movie about it in the last 50 years has Michael Caine doing a terrible German accent.
Yeah. And something that has been kind of touched on is how the way history is popularly imagined often tells us more about us now and what we think about ourselves than actually what happened. Can you guys talk about that a little bit and maybe give some examples?
Well, yeah, historical memory is something that interests me a lot, and that's a very common theme in our podcast is what historical media says about the time that created it, and it always says so much. I think that just as an example right now, so one era that we've talked about a bit, or yeah, an era that we've talked about a bit that doesn't get much attention in Hollywood, but has gotten a lot, but is very important to the formation of modern politics, is the kind of early medieval period, like when different ancient tribal groups were settling down in the ruins of the Roman Empire, all that stuff. There's a lot of really interesting historical work being done right now on that period, the fall of Rome and the earliest Middle Ages. Guy Halsall is a really good historian about that era in particular, and we draw a lot from that one guy, especially. But it's a surprisingly politically charged era because a lot of modern European countries root or attempt to root their identities in historical records from that era. A lot of people are really attached to the idea that their modern national identity, which generally speaking has a lot to do with modern politics, like, there wasn't the German cultural identity was largely shaped by like the 30 Years' War. And then, and of course, there wasn't even any kind of unified German nation until the later 18th century, later 19th century. But a lot of German nationalist historians had a very strong interest in using the ancient past to justify and to legitimize their political ambitions. So that's why when you're dealing with that era in particular, oftentimes the scholarship of like ancient Germanic tribes is unfortunately tainted by people whose political ideology was used to justify a lot of very, very terrible things in the 20th century. This is with the example of German nationalism in particular. And staying with that example, I think that a good example, an interesting look at how kind of like a media depictions reflect historical memory. One of our earliest episodes was on this Netflix show called Barbarians, this German series about Arminius, this famous barbarian rebel against Rome in like the year 50 AD, around then. It just got a second season. It's a fun show. It's like kind of classic, like, sword and sandal adventure with this barbarian setting, but although it's very self-consciously rejecting a lot of the German nationalist precepts that color and, I would say, misinterpret the ancient past, it still falls into a lot of those same kinds of traps in depicting the Germanic-speaking barbarians as like inherently free and naturally democratic people, using this language that made sense to 19th century nationalists and makes sense to people with democratic ideals today, but doesn't necessarily reflect how these ancient peoples saw themselves. And then on top of that, a lot of other scholarship of Roman times and in general has this kind of very kind of like integrationist model, like the idea that like, oh, the Romans brought Europe together and that's really good, which clearly shows this kind of EU kind of European integration ideal going into modern politics, which I think is kind of funny. And it's incredibly hard for people to not color their interpretation of the past with their experience of the present, and that is never more obvious than in historical fiction.
Yeah, and you don't even have to look at people misunderstanding the ancient past to see this in action. Just look at how World War II is our automatic reference point for everything.
Oh yeah.
And like it's always like a lot of current events are always read through that gloss. Like someone is Hitler, someone is someone is lusting for the Sudetenland, etc. It's just, I guess it's somewhat more mediated in terms of World War II, because again, most people living today have like a grandparent who fought, who they would have known that grandparent. So there is an anchor there. But on the other hand, it also lends itself much more to political messaging, just because it's something that looks vaguely familiar to people. And you could use that to ram any number of agendas through based on like these vague sentimental feelings for pop.
Yeah, and that's why I think that if we're talking about the importance of historical accuracy in fiction, I think that it is most important when you're dealing with the most recent past, like the 20th century, 21st century, because that's when it's very easy for any kind of interpretation of the recent past to basically serve as propaganda in some form. So I think that, like, for example, like so many Hollywood movies about Vietnam, even if there are like nominally anti-war, ultimately reinforce really unfortunate and often very racist ideas about Vietnamese people. Like the most infamous example is The Deer Hunter is a very celebrated film. Film students, film scholars love it, but it has pretty repellent politics because even though it is an anti-war movie, it does something very very weird, which Rick Perlstein, who I'm a big fan of, was the first to point out, which is that a lot of the inspiration of The Deer Hunter came from Time magazine articles about atrocities being committed in Vietnam against prisoners. But the atrocities being committed and the prisoners in question were North Vietnamese prisoners held by the American-backed South Vietnam. There were terrible cases of South Vietnam, who was America's ally or puppet in the war, holding people in these underground prison cells and these what they called tiger pits dug into the ground. The movie The Deer Hunter takes those real life atrocities, but instead makes them atrocities committed by the North Vietnamese communists against Americans, which I think is very repellent.
Yeah, definitely a lot of Vietnam movies do this, even if they predict brutality. The way that they present the Vietnamese people is very icky to an audience today.
And it's so common with the Rock movies too,
Yeah, Rock especially, because pretty much everyone today has memories of that too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting for modern things because they become mediated almost immediately. Like they made movies about World War II during World War II.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is there anything there you guys might want to talk about?
Sure. Well, I think it's that his like historical the construction of historical memory happens while history is still happening. Like the tropes of World War II movies of all these like Brooklyn Italian guys and like Southern good old boys overcoming their differences to fight the Nazis. Like those movies like that were being made when the war was still happening. You mentioned the Old West. There were like a lot of the most popular writers in the like 1870s were writing westerns when the West still existed. Like Bret Hart, like people like that, which I think is very funny. And a lot of times, fiction is the main way people interface with the past and the present. And I think that fiction tends to loom a lot larger in the creation of historical memory than actual education does. And that's why, and so I think which is usually a bad thing. It usually means that misinterpretations that filmmakers make for the sake of the narrative, for the sake of box office success, will lead to misinterpretations of the actual past. The only silver lining here is that once these historical narratives are created, it's really, really hard to overturn them. So when nationalists and right-wingers these days try to deliberately distort history in a more nationalistic direction, if their nationalism conflicts with Hollywood and with popular consciousness, it's really hard to fight that. So basically, I don't think DeSantis can change American history too much in Florida, because movies people watch are always going to play a bigger role in whatever they hear in school.
Yeah, you can't ban books out of that
Yeah.
popular conception.
Exactly. Yeah. And even if you do ban the books, ultimately, a Disney princess movie is going to have a much bigger role. Like Aladdin is going to have a lot bigger role of your interpretation of like the medieval Middle East than a history book that's banned in your school.
Yeah. Sam, do you have anything to add?
No, Liam covered it all very beautifully.
So, kind of following from what we were just saying, if you guys had a magic wand and you could change the public perception of certain historical events, if you could, take out the misconceptions and add a different perception of, big historical events or eras or whatever, what would you change?
I'll let Sam think of a better answer, because I'm just going to give a really bad, obvious one, which is just the idea that, like, America is always the good guys. It's like, this is something that I'm sure like you and your listeners probably don't need to be corrected about, but I think a lot of normies, they still have trouble accepting that the United States is capable of doing very bad things, and that just because the U.S. is engaged in a conflict with a foreign enemy doesn't mean that that enemy is necessarily more brutal or less in the right than the U.S. I think that this is most obvious with anything about the Cold War, with depictions of the North Vietnam and Cuba. I think that this still kind of rings true today, where it's very easy for Americans, in large part due to Hollywood, to accept absolute brutalities happening in other countries, like in the Soviet Union, but have trouble looking back on atrocities happening much closer to home. So yeah, if I could do anything, I would basically try to take away the rose-colored glasses people have towards American history. But that's such a low-hanging fruit answer that I'm sure Russian Sam can think of a better answer than that.
Yeah, I guess for me, it would be that it would be the idea that something being old is in and of itself good and something to be looked up to, like what Liam was talking about with like socialist Jesus or whatever.
Yeah.
This obsessive need to anchor something in the past to give it legitimacy, rather than examining things on their own terms and coming to a conclusion based on that.
Yeah, and that's so common. Like, I read a little bit about of David Graeber's and David Wengrow's the Dawn of Everything, which is a very interesting new archaeological and anthropological book about the social structures of a lot of indigenous people of the Americas. But what I don't like about some of the conclusions the book draws, and especially conclusions that a lot of fans of the book draw, are basically that because these social structures existed among these peoples in the Americas 500 years ago, that means that they somehow can justify social structures we're trying to build today. I think that's ultimately, even if it's well-intentioned, that's basically a reactionary framework. The idea that something has to exist in the past, something has to be ancient for it to be worth building in the present.
Yeah, and it's also very heavily predicated on this idea of the noble savage that's just
unfortunately
been really pissing me off for quite a while. Like this idea that I mean, for example, that indigenous people are necessarily like living in harmony with nature and are all peaceful and kumbaya or whatever. And it's just
rather
like
than actively manipulating nature the way that basically all cultures, pretty much all cultures do. Like the Amazon rainforest a lot of the Amazon rainforest is quite recent, because it was land that had been cultivated prior to colonization and genocide.
Or even going before that, there's a reason why the megafauna start disappearing around the same time that the Americas start getting peopled.
Yeah, that's a great critique of the book. It is interesting seeing how they talk about these like wonderful democratic structures in the New World, and then also talk about like the Mississippi Valley civilization a
Yes,
bunch, and like this
incredibly
whole
stratified.
slave
Yeah.
society.
No, no, exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you see kind of noble savage stuff with any cultures that people perceive of as primitive, which is it's always very condescending, even if it's well intentioned. You see this when it comes to prehistoric peoples of Europe and the Middle East. I think in general there's this idea that there's a strong interest in uh, with a lot of left wing people in trying to both project your modern political understanding onto the past and then in return use this new interpretation of the past to justify your politics today, even though that kind of justification is not necessary.
Yeah, definitely. It just made me think of a recent Twitter poll that I saw going around. Who was the good guys, in World War One, the Central Powers or the Entente? Just it kind of demonstrates how silly it is to project
Absolutely,
certain
yeah,
ideas of
yeah.
modern good and
No,
bad
yeah,
from a lot of
absolutely, yeah, no,
historical
yes,
events.
yes. Yeah.
All
This
right.
is very funny.
All right. So now moving into sort of the last section, going into some specific movies about, different historical periods and events. So I want to hear what your favorite movies that depict, like, I'm going to list a bunch of different eras and stuff.
For sure.
So starting with Antiquity, what are your favorite movies about ancient Egypt?
Ooh, there's so few. Like, dude, I think I just gotta say, like, there's the Mummy, and there's its prequel, the Scorpion King. There's like the old Mummy. So I honestly I gotta say, Brendan Fraser, the Mummy. It's really fun, and it's like one of the only ones I can think of.
Well, for me, I'm gonna say it's Prince of Egypt. Unfortunately,
Oh
this,
God, what am I saying? Of
Yeah, just
course.
thinking that.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the better answer.
yeah, like again, not really historically accurate. There's zero evidence for any of the stuff that's described in
Yeah,
Exodus
the
in
Exodus
the
narrative, yeah.
archaeological record, but nevertheless, it's a very beautiful movie. It's very compelling. It's
Yeah.
got a beautiful soundtrack, and it again, it gives you a great look. Uh, it gives children a great look into basically the foundation of Western civilization, speaking as broadly as possible.
Yeah,
Like this
or
is the foundation myth.
I'll qualify that, or I would say, brings all back home, the origins of the popular consensus, culturally, the popular history imagination of something called Western civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like again, I'm using Western civilization as a shorthand. I'm not sure I even believe in such a thing, but insofar as you can speak about Western civilization, the Exodus story has to be a very important component of the understanding of that civilization of itself.
Yeah, definitely. So what about ancient Greece?
I'm not very familiar with ancient Greece and the movies about it. Gonna need to see what Liam suggests and watch that immediately.
It's not a great, it's a terrible depiction of the past, but it's very fun, and it says a lot about how modern people perceive the past, and that's I think is it Oliver Stone, Troy from like 2002.
Mm.
Uh, I think speaking of your kind of modern interpretations of the past, completely take away any potential gay subtext with Achilles, and instead, the first time you see him is he's in a threesome with two women.
Yeah, definitely recasting something that's pretty well known, I think, in a lot of
Yeah,
circles.
yeah, like, you can see the
Yeah.
pottery. Like they didn't try to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So moving outside of a, well, Western, big air quotes,
Hmm.
context, what about ancient China or India or anything outside of
For
Europe?
sure. Also, there's a Chinese TV show I like a lot. It might not be ancient per se. It's like early medieval, but it's called I think it's just called something like Bad Day in Chang'an. I think that might be the English title, or
Oh
no,
yes, I've heard of it.
Longest Day in Chang'an. And it's this like it's very long, so most Chinese TV shows are, but it's this really beautifully constructed kind of a conspiracy movie about an attempt to assassinate all these Tang Dynasty officials in the capital.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I don't know enough about Chinese like material culture to say if it's historically accurate, but it's definitely believable, and it's very interesting and exciting. And it goes into it touches on the kind of ties that Tang era China in like the 8th, 9th, 10th century had with the cultures of the steppe, like the Turkic and Mongolic speaking peoples that they interacted with very heavily, which I think is kind of cool.
Did either of you see the movie The Great Wall? I think it was called.
Oh, I've heard of it.
I saw a little bit about it. Yeah, that's where Matt Damon plays like a Roman guy hired to like defend the Great Wall of China from monsters.
He gets like impressed basically by them. Like they just like take him in. He's like, all right, I'll help you out.
You're telling
I can't believe Zhang Yimou made that.
Oh, I know. Yeah, it's beloved director making me like that. Although I must say, I think a better term might be he gets shanghaied.
Yeah. All right. So last one in Antiquity, ancient Rome.
It's got to be I, Claudius. That's a show, not a movie, but it's I, Claudius is just so well done. Also a good example of one that isn't necessarily very historically accurate because the writer Robert Graves who did the visual novel, he did quite a lot of things with his characters that those characters did not do in real life. But it's a really fun way of looking at the past. And it's a great if you're not familiar with like early Roman imperial history, like the first century, so the same era as barbarians, the same era as like a lot of Bible movies. It's set in the lifetime of Jesus. If you're not familiar with what was going on in Rome in the first century, it's a great jumping off point. You just got to take it all with a grain of salt. Treat it as fiction, not as history.
Yeah, for Rome, I'm going to have to give a bit of a more unconventional answer and say Life of Brian, because I mean, technically it fits the bill, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's of course a really funny look at history. And again, I think it's great world building because again, it's not historically accurate in the slightest, just because I mean, the Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Judea, like a lot of it is just ribbing at current events in like the 60s and 70s, of course. But it also does a great job of sketching out the context of where Jesus emerges, right? Where you're living in this land under foreign occupation, where a lot of people end up losing because of that. And you have an entire class of people who are going around and preaching to people who are living under these conditions and are feeling really lost. So again, probably without intending to do it, I think that that Monty Python did a great job of sketching out what living in this period would have been like.
Thank you. So before moving on, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you your guys' thoughts on Gladiator, because that is probably the biggest, most popular movie that depicts ancient Rome in popular memory.
Yeah, I think it has to be. Yeah, and they just announced a sequel, I think with Austin Butler. So Elvis as Maximus's son, I believe. Yeah, so it did. I think that it did. Okay, I'll say this. It gets so from a historical accuracy perspective, it's like totally bunk. But I think that in terms of getting people interested in ancient history, I think it probably I think it has a very positive impact. I think for the most part, like I think there's a lot of people who decided to study history as a hobby or even as a profession because of the success of that movie and other movies that came in its wake, like Troy, the one I mentioned earlier. I think Troy only came out because Gladiator was such a hit. It's a good narrative. It's like classic, Hollywood heartstrings kind of stuff, just like Braveheart. And just like Braveheart, it gets a lot wrong, but I think it's a fine movie. I think if it has any negative impact, it's that a lot of really annoying right-wing guys are really into Marcus Aurelius right now, and I think that movie is probably the reason for that.
Sam, you have anything to add on Gladiator?
On Gladiator itself, not really, just because I haven't seen it since I was a teenager. But I mean, that kind of stuff is kind of why I was drawn to having a history movie podcast in the first place, right? Because again, you're sketching out like the basic contours of this world, and you're using the podcast as a medium to dive into the history of that, while at the same time you're able to use the movie as a reference point, so that even if people aren't really like familiar with third century Roman military life, they can nevertheless just see, oh yeah, that's what's shown in the movie, and this is what that actually means. Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. And also, I'll just say that one thing I like about it a lot is that I have a lot of respect for both Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe for just like finding a historical era they're interested in for a couple of years and then like making a movie about that time. I think like I would absolutely do that if I had their clout in the industry.
Well, I actually do have a question kind of in that vein for the end, so we'll get to
For
something like
sure.
that. So moving on to the Middle Ages, what do you guys think is a good depiction of the unfortunately named Dark Ages, if you can really call them that?
Because there's
Yeah.
not a lot. So I'll have to think for a second. And a lot of like, well, okay, actually, I'll just say the Northman because I came out recently. I liked it a lot. It's a depiction of Norse society that draws a lot from Hollywood, but I think does a good job at trying to kind of recapitulate these tropes in a way that blends them with recent scholarship to give a view of the early Middle Ages, which is not what viewers are expecting and is probably more faithful, certainly more faithful than most Viking media. So I would say that one, but I'll let Sam take it.
I'd have to say The Last Duel. I'm not super familiar with movies of this period, but
Oh,
I
if you,
watched that
yeah,
one
that's
recently.
later, but yeah, the last one's great.
Oh, I mean, it's like right on the cusp of the Crusades, right? So, I mean, that would count as the
It
Dark
was
Ages, no?
it's set in the 1300s. It's like
Oh,
after.
okay. Yeah. So a little early. In that
No,
case,
no.
yeah. Yeah, not sure in that case. Yeah.
All right. So you kind of got this with the Northmen, but Vikings?
We should talk about let's talk about other Viking media because a lot of it's very fun from an entertainment standpoint, but it's just like it's not remotely like it's a very cartoonish view of the past. Like for example, History Channel Vikings. It's a fun show. I think you've seen most of it, right, Sam?
I've seen up to like season 4, I think.
Yeah, it's just like it's interesting because it starts out with a very old school kind of like gung ho, very kind of like macho Viking depiction, the kind of things that like bad people who like the Vikings like a lot. And then it's kind of funny as the show goes on, you start seeing the perspective of Norse culture sort of change. It doesn't become more critical of the brutal aspects of Norse culture. Instead, it kind of like it kind of shifts to a more kind of like woke Vikings attitude, which I think is kind of funny. It kind of shows how
Yeah.
how values changed among the people who made the show as it goes on. One thing I think is kind of goofy, or I don't know, not goofy. There's a new Vikings show called Vikings Valhalla, which is like the sequel spin-off that's on Netflix now, and I think it's got higher production values than the original. The writing's a little bit weaker, but what I think is interesting is that it tries to make it depicts descendants of the Vikings living in medieval in like Anglo-Saxon Britain as basically like an oppressed ethnic group who suffer racial discrimination. And I think that's that's a little bit of a risky road to go down, but I do think it's kind of an unexpected angle. And I'm not sure I totally agree with that depiction, but I know there certainly was stigmatization of people who were of Norse descent living in England. And so I think that this kind of change in perspective that you see with some media in the last like 10 years, it does lead to some interesting stuff, even if it's not necessarily accurate and might have some not so great implications if you look too closely at it.
Yeah. And before we continue, I would just like to put in my 2 cents on Northmen, just because it's just something that I have been thinking about. Earlier in the conversation, Liam talked about the challenges of communicating past values to a contemporary audience.
Yeah.
And that's really why I enjoyed the Northmen so much, because they do an excellent job of showing that like these people are nothing like what you would comprehend. I mean, they're like in communion with various gods. They're living under a very rigid system of honor, which basically impels them to seek revenge, even if it means their own death. And it's just, I have a feeling that like a lot of the right-wing fans of this movie either don't really understand what they are idolizing, or would just go in there and drop that immediately.
Yeah, and I think that movie. I don't know. I guess I don't want to spoil it necessarily if you haven't seen it, but it has an ending that is tragic from a modern perspective. And Robert Eggers definitely knew what he was doing with that. He was trying to show that this character does something that modern people could not comprehend and would see as incredibly repellent. And it has disastrous consequences from him. But in the specific social context of this character's world, his decisions make sense, even if they horrify the audience. And I think that's kind of cool. One episode we did a while back was on this Roman movie called Quo Vadis about early Christianity. It's a pretty good movie. It's from the 50s. But what I found most affecting about Quo Vadis was that there are characters, Christian characters and pagan characters, both have deaths that are very noble in that respective culture. There is this noble pagan guy, this like virtuous pagan who kills himself because that was seen as the most honorable death for a Roman patrician. But then among the Christians, you see all these people get martyred. You see there's a scene where St. Peter is crucified upside down, which is like the biblical narrative. Because for him, with that belief system, dying at your enemy's hand for your beliefs instead of killing yourself to protect your honor, that is what is most virtuous. And I think that's a very cool, very deliberate decision on the part of the filmmakers of Quo Vadis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. So moving to the later Middle Ages, what are some good depictions of the Crusades?
There's not that many. There's the Cecil B. DeMille Crusades from the 30s, which is one of those like huge spectacles that nobody cares about anymore because it was black and white, and people only want to watch the color epics. But of course, the other one you have to mention, which I actually never got around to watching until a few years ago. I was really slow on this. The famous one, it's also Ridley Scott. It's Kingdom of Heaven. So that's one where I know he definitely plays fast and loose with a lot of the details, and I think that most of the primary characters are very are totally fictitious, and there are some scenes that are a little cheesy, and the story doesn't totally work all the way, but visually it's just really, really beautiful. The depiction of King Baldwin, the kid in the gold mask, like that, come on, that's so cool. Like you gotta love it. And it has a very kind of I think in its own way, talking about just a little bit historical memory here, it has a very modern kind of 2000s view of the Crusades, very much informed by a kind of moderate liberal anti-war on terror kind of message that has an understanding of both modern conflicts in the Middle East, particularly the Iraq War, which was like just starting, I think, when that movie came out, like 2004, 2005, as one of another kind of like series of pointless conflicts in the Middle East between different cultures that should just get along with each other. So then ultimately Kingdom of Heaven has this kind of message of promoting understanding between the Saracens and the Crusaders.
Okay, so kind of getting into the High Middle Ages / Renaissance period. What do you guys think?
You go first, Sam. I think you have an answer.
I'm gonna have to go with Andrei Rublev by Tarkovsky. That's of course a classic. It's about an icon maker in Rus in like the 13th, 14th century, I want to say. And it's an incredibly beautifully shot film. It's got great acting. It's got everything that you could possibly want in a historical movie. So run, don't walk to watch Andrei Rublev immediately.
And I'll say Kurosawa's Throne of Blood. And if anyone hasn't seen that, you got to watch it immediately. It's Akira Kurosawa doing Macbeth as a story of a medieval Japanese shogun. And the story is totally fictitious. It's not about anything that ever actually happens, I don't think. But what I like about it a lot is that Kurosawa and his production design team, they made a really strong effort to break away from a lot of the visual aesthetic tropes you see in other samurai movies to look deeper at the actual archaeological record of medieval Japan. So the costumes feel very different, and the acting style I think is based on traditional Japanese theater. So it feels very alien in some ways, more so than most Japanese films. But it's really exciting and just really beautifully done. I think it's from the late 60s. It's black and white, but it's just really gorgeous. And it's a view of feudal Japan, really unlike anything that's been done before or since. Throne of Blood.
Very cool. I haven't seen it. I'll have to put it on my
It's
list.
great.
All right. Are there any other Middle Ages movies that you guys would like to mention before we move on?
Last couple of years, there's been a few really good ones. Like, but I think just last year we had both The Green Knight, which I really enjoyed. Mostly enjoyed as kind of from a filmmaking perspective. It's a very fun narrative. They do a lot of cool things there. Some of the choices feel a little bit too kind of like goofy for goofiness' sake, but I really enjoyed it. Another one that came out last year that Sam already mentioned was The Last Duel, which was also very interesting. I think that was a good one that just a great job showing the depicting the values of a previous era in a way that you don't usually see. It's, I think, just in the same vein as The Northman. The director takes pains to show that the values that were normal in this era were very bad for a lot of people, and that, you know, which I think is a nice antidote to the kind of unconscious lionization of older values that people do even on the left sometimes. And so that's why I like that one a lot. Going back 20 years earlier, I think I also mentioned this earlier, A Knight's Tale. It's great, man. Like I love it. I can watch the movie like any time of day. I can watch it all day long. It's super fun. R.I.P. Heath Ledger. Also, Mark Addy, who plays Robert Baratheon in Game of Thrones. That's one of his first roles as this like jolly, chubby blacksmith.
Sam, do you have any?
No, not really. I'm not super familiar with this period, unfortunately. But yeah, Last Duel,
Yeah.
check it out. You'll get an idea of what feudalism entailed in practice.
I'll say also, I still have to get around to reading the book, but the film with In the Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, really good. It's if you look, if anyone's played that game Pentiment that just came out like a couple months ago, you would love In the Name of the Rose. It's about life in a medieval monastery, and it goes surprisingly deep into the role of Platonic philosophy in medieval Christianity, and especially the role of Platonic philosophy in heresy, which is kind of cool.
All right, so moving on to the early modern period, what are some of the best depictions of the colonial Americas? The whole thing.
Ooh, okay.
Okay.
You go, Sam.
Oh, okay. Recently I watched this Canadian movie called Black Robe, which is really interesting. It's basically the story of a Jesuit in very early French Canada who has to go from the big settlement into one of the faraway outlying settlements where there had been some success in converting some of the locals. And so basically it's an exploration of early colonial encounters. It does a great job of showing the dynamics between early Europeans and Native Americans. It depicts their values. Once again, big sticking point. It's hard to get a sense of who these people were without falling back on a lot of really well-intentioned but ultimately harmful ideas. But this movie, it does a great job both of showcasing Native American life, their cultures, the competition between Native Americans, and how the French step into all of that, basically.
Yeah. Before we go to the future U.S., I'll just say one other non-U.S. example. Aguirre, The Wrath of God. Like, it's a great movie by Werner Herzog, starring Klaus Kinski as this real-life mad conquistador who tried to proclaim himself emperor of South America in the like 1540 or then pretty early. It's the story of the movie deviates pretty heavily from what the real Aguirre actually tried to do. He was actually much more successful even than the movie depicts him as. But it's a very fun, very spooky movie that gives you a lot to think about just kind of colonization and what exactly these guys were trying to do and who are the kinds of personalities attracted to a colonial project and all that that entails.
So now moving on to the American Revolution. What movies do you guys like about the Revolution?
There's surprisingly not that many. Like obviously there's The Patriot, which I'm not really a fan of for a few reasons. There's a lot of older American Revolution stuff, and there was that TV show Turn. I think it was on Netflix, which is about it was kind of mid-budget. It was okay about espionage, the American Revolution. But I guess I have to go with the HBO John Adams with Paul Giamatti.
Mm.
I saw it like a year ago, and I don't love everything about it, but it's a good example of a perspective on of a sympathetic perspective of somebody who doesn't usually get a sympathetic portrayal, because so much popular American history focuses on Thomas Jefferson, who I am not so much of a fan of, and it's basically, it kind of does the same thing that Hamilton did, but like 10 years earlier, and fortunately without nearly Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Yeah, I honestly don't. Again, I'm not super familiar with American cinema. Unfortunately, I'm gonna try to remedy that this year. But as of right now,
he's our
unfortunately,
Soviet
not.
man over here.
Yes.
Yeah, we will get to the Soviets. But before that, any movies that come to mind about the French Revolution or really any other things from the early modern period you want to mention?
I think. Well, I'll just say this is earlier in the early modern period, but I really just got to hammer home how good Wolf Hall is. It's made me think quite a lot about British history and the kind of formation of the early modern world, or the modern world more broadly. And I've been reading a lot about the early modern period, this year especially, and that's a period that I never was as familiar with as I was for some other periods. And it's so interesting. And that Hilary Mantel just does an amazing job constructing this world and drawing this very beautiful emotional story out of an incredibly scarce historical record about these people.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to say that the 1966 version of War and Peace is an absolute must-watch. It's great. They got a bunch of extras from the Red Army to star in it, so you get actual battle scenes with thousands of people. It's incredible to see.
All right, so moving on to the modern period. There's so much to go into here. There's so many movies, so I'm trying to restrict it down a little bit to a few kind of key events, starting with the American Civil War.
You froze for a second, Brian, or maybe it was me.
I think the whole thing froze because I saw it froze.
Oh, okay. If you could just go back 10 seconds then.
Yeah. So starting with the American Civil War for our first modern event.
I'm gonna have to say Lincoln. It's kind of a snooze fest for many people, I know, but I did very much enjoy seeing this period depicted. For further context, it's about basically Lincoln trying to get the Emancipation Proclamation through Congress at a time when, even as this war is being fought, there are many toadies, for lack of a better word, who just want peace, even if it means the preservation of slavery. And through this movie, you kind of get a sense of Lincoln's own evolution with regards to this question, because, again, he has that famous line about how if I could preserve the Union by keeping slavery, I would do it. And yeah, you can see how that man, the one that he was only 3 years before that, became an actual anti-slavery crusader who's trying to snuff that out specifically.
Yeah, well, I would say kind of an earlier one. I wasn't so much a fan of Lincoln. I respect what he was going for there, Spielberg, but I would say Glory from 1992, I want to say, with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick, which is an insane screen pairing, but they're great together. It's a really good movie about one of the African American regiments in the war. And I've been told that it's one of the most historically accurate Civil War depictions I don't know enough about the Civil War to say if that's true. That's the question for the war nerd, John Dolan. But I like that one a lot.
All right. So, what about 19th century imperialism?
That's a great one. There's a lot to go with there. Um, okay. I know absolutely. It's one that I just saw for the first time about a year ago that I never knew existed. I think that Sam, I've talked about this with you before. You might not remember this. The Four Feathers from like 1939 or something like that. Does that ring a bell, Sam?
No, it
Okay.
doesn't.
So The Four Feathers is a movie. It's based on a book by like Thackeray, I want to say. That's from, and it's set during the mostly forgotten 19th century. What do they call it? Like the Mahdi War, I guess they'd call it, in Sudan.
Oh,
When in the like 1880s, the British Empire went to war with this Islamic movement in around Khartoum, the capital of Sudan today. And the movie is about this guy who he is given a white feather as a sign of cowardice because he doesn't participate in the war. And so to redeem himself, he goes alone into Sudan to like rescue his friends who are being held captive by the Mahdists. And so this is a movie with just completely repellent politics. It is just openly pro-imperial. It was written in 1935, like basically like the height of the British Empire territorially, when like everyone thought it was going to go on forever. Because they didn't realize how that the steam was already running out. And it's absolutely a piece of like naked imperial propaganda, but it's at the same time it's a really exciting, compelling narrative, and it's from the 30s, but it's an early color film that's aged amazingly well from a narrative standpoint. I don't know if it was shot in Sudan itself, but a lot of it was certainly shot in Egypt on location, and seeing the vistas there is really interesting. And it's also one where the politics are so nakedly laid bare that you don't really have to worry about being propagandized because like it's all right in front of your eyes. And it's a really interesting look at an aspect of historical memory that Americans today, especially that people today, especially Americans, just don't really have any awareness of. That like this small colonial conflict in Sudan, the entire British Empire against a very much outmatched local Sudanese army was seen as this essential struggle for civilization in the minds of Brits at that time.
mm-hmm. Yeah. As for me, nothing really comes from nothing comes to mind movie-wise for 19th century imperialism at the moment. But one that I recommend without any reservations whatsoever would be the Human Condition trilogy, which is set in World War II era Manchuria, basically, and it's about the protagonist who's like this sort of left-leaning bureaucrat from Japan who finds himself in the midst of absolutely incomprehensible colonial repression of the Chinese, and it basically tracks his journey as he is coming to understand what Japan is doing and what the way out is ultimately.
That sounds very interesting. So
yeah, it's like 12 hours long, by the way, so it's not not an afternoon watch.
I'm sure that'll be an interesting marathon going through that whole. All right. So skipping obviously so much, World War I movies or TV shows.
Recently there's that new All Quiet on the Western Front movie.
I
watched
saw
it a
it
couple
last
of days
night.
ago.
I just watched it a few hours ago.
Yeah, I am not a fan, but instead I am going to recommend the 1930 original. That one is far superior.
W. Pops. But you guys tell us, Sam. Why do you like the original better than the new one?
I don't know. I just felt like on the one hand, the new one does really show you a lot of the gore in ways that aren't present in the 1931, but
of course, yeah.
But it felt like he was kind of relishing in it in a way. I just couldn't really stomach that.
It's kind of the whole like no such thing as an anti-war movie problem.
Yeah,
Or like
maybe
it's
that's
very
it.
hard. It's hard to depict war in a traditional narrative without romanticizing it in some sense. And
Hmm.
I certainly don't think the movie was trying to do that, but I can see how you might how I can see how you would think that. Like I get your interpretation.
Hmm. Yeah, but speaking of romanticizing, I'm also going to have to plug 1917. I think, although again, it's not unqualified, I take issue with how many things in that movie are showcased. But nevertheless, from a film perspective and from an emotional perspective, it's very good.
Um, Liam, did you have any on World War One?
So,
All right. So how about this is let's maybe take a little pause here because the film exists as a medium at this point in history.
yeah.
So
Hmm.
how do you guys think that the fact that like events and stuff can be depicted in film immediately changes the way that we think about and perceive the past?
Oh yeah, no, it's so important. Like we were talking earlier about how like the tropes of World War II movies existed in like 1941. It's I think it's really interesting. Like that's just it just suddenly emerges around the time of World War One. Because like the first commercial like feature length movies come out right at the start of the war. Like I think Cabiria is like 1914. Probably it's this Italian feature film. Birth of a Nation 1915. Uh, and so there's suddenly this enormously fast way of conveying information about any part of the human experience, especially war, to the masses. Like and even with news, like what I was so shocked to learn that there's footage of the Kronstadt rebellion in the Soviet Union. There's footage of the German Revolution in 1919. You can see
Hmm.
it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and that just that really does change the perspective, and that means that yeah, starting with the teens and the 20s, history is being filmed, history is being produced as fiction as it's happening in ways you can consume. Like usually like the Pobst, this is that was kind of a period piece, but like the Pobst All Quiet on the Western Front came out in like 1930 or something like that. And
Yeah,
then
that's it.
he did a silent one, I think it was silent in Germany before he came to the US, called something like, I think it was called like West Front 1917 or something, which is very similar. And that was just like basically like a decade after the events took place, which is very interesting. And you can kind of you get to see this popular consensus building in real time. This you
Hmm.
see the construction of popular history.
Yeah, and it's very much a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you have the ability to convey much more information and make that stick. But on the other hand, you have the ability to convey much more information and make that stick. So it's much easier to shift people's perceptions through
Yeah.
a movie uh than through a booklet, for example.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So speaking of shifting perceptions with movies, let's talk about some World War II movies, maybe some of the ones made like during or just prior to the war, and then the more retrospective ones.
Sure. Oh, I'll say for during the war, there was a lot of surprisingly pro-Soviet movies made in Hollywood in like 1944, 45, because there was such a need for cooperation with the USSR and the Eastern Front that in the European theater, I mean, that a lot of Hollywood producers were interested in more sympathetic portrayals of recent Soviet history. Like I haven't seen it yet, but I really want to see it. I think it's from like 1943 or something. It's called Mission to Moscow because
Oh, yes.
it's a movie about a real life American about a real life American attaché to the USSR in the early 30s during like the infamous Stalinist show trials of the purges, with a very sympathetic portrayal of the Stalinist government, which I think is like it's hilarious. I
Good,
really
yeah.
got around to watching that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Sam, did you have any? Yeah.
Nothing contemporary, but I have a great list of Soviet movies that I think everyone
Please,
would
yeah,
enjoy.
yeah.
Yeah,
Shout out a few
definitely.
of your favorites.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, everyone knows the more famous ones, like Come and See, The Cranes Are Flying.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
Live in
focus on.
Childhood.
Yes. I'm gonna focus on ones that I think Western audiences aren't as familiar with. Uh, I'm going to start with The Fate of a Man, directed by Bondarchuk, 1959, I believe it is. And it's very interesting because it's not like the World War II movies that people are used to per se, about like these grand battles and everything. It's about it's about basically the story of a man being taken as a prisoner of war and the ordeals that he has to go through in a Nazi labor camp. It's very emotionally hard hitting, and that's a definite must watch, I would have to say. I have more, but Liam can go if you'd like.
Sure, yeah. For I guess for looking for more recent World War II movies, actually nothing's automatically coming to mind. So let's look up more you like, Sam.
Okay. Well, another one that I watched recently actually is called The Ascent. It's a 1969 movie by Larisa Shepitka, I think. And again, it's kind of an unconventional take in that it's looking at what happens to a group of partisans who in Belarus who get caught by the Germans, and how they respond to the enticement to become collaborators. Basically, it's based on a novel by a man named Vasily Bykov. That novel has been translated into English, by the way, so it is available if anyone would like to watch it. And the novel, it does sketch out the world a bit better, but it's a wonderful moral conundrum, right?
No, absolutely, yeah. No, and actually, as we're thinking of another moral conundrum World War II movie, there's this Japanese movie I like a lot, this anti-war Japanese film from the 50s called Harp of Burma, which is about this stranded group of Japanese soldiers at the end of the war in Burma, this like imperialist expeditionary force, who basically have to make the choice to betray their Japanese homeland, which is pretty cool. And one other one I just thought of that's another kind of similar, like morally complex World War II movie. A Bridge Too Far, this 70s British movie. It's like the last old school traditional World War II movie with a very like old school soundtrack. It feels like it could have been made in the 50s with one big difference, which is that it depicts a pretty rare Allied failure in the European theater. It's about I think it's called like the Arnhem campaign or something, some like pretty small and unimportant town in like the Netherlands, I think, or maybe Belgium. And basically the like stodgy aristocratic British command, they just didn't listen to anyone on the ground, which led to this very awful defeat at the hands of the Nazis, where all these British troops were captured prisoner. And it's a very well done movie. And it's very depressing because it's a story of failure. And so at the time, people hated it. It's kind of like how nobody wanted to watch The Last Valley right after Vietnam. Nobody wanted to watch a movie about the good guys losing a battle in World War II after Vietnam also.
Right.
Any other World War II movies you guys want to
I guess I'm gonna plug my grandfather's favorite, rest in peace. It's a movie called Only Old Men Go Into Battle, which is it's much more sentimental. It's basically the story of a regiment, this group of friends, basically, in during World War II, and like in what's today Ukraine, I guess around 1943. And it basically like covers the life of this regiment, and there's love, there's drama, there's of course death, and it's a great movie.
All right, so there's I think too many historical events in the 20th century to get into all of them, so
yeah,
I'm just going to break it up into Cold War and then post-Cold War era. What are some of your just favorites about anything from the Cold War era?
well, I was anything by Jean Le Carré. When it comes to Cold War espionage, he is just the master of that. I still have to get around to actually reading his novels, but the adaptations I've seen of any of them are just excellent. The Little Drummer Girl, both versions of Tinker Tailor Spy, And the one I'm going to focus on right now is The Spy Who Came in from the Cold. I want to say like 66, 68 with Richard Burton. It is the anti-James Bond. It's this very cool and depressing, very almost slow-paced at times espionage movie about the daily life of this MI6 agent who is locked in this years-long chase with an East German agent. And so it's this really cool cat and mouse game between two guys who never actually meet each other. As you think one of them has the upper hand, then the other guy does. It's kind of depressing, but it's so tense, and it manages to be incredibly tense without needing any kind of extensive scenes of like gunplay. You know, it's like it's as exciting as a James Bond movie without a single explosion.
Very cool. Sam?
I'm gonna go with the conventional one this time and say Doctor Strangelove, of
Oh yeah,
course.
yeah, you gotta love it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you want to elaborate on it.
There's so many though, because so many movies from from like the 60s, 70s, and 80s are just about in some way the Cold War, if in spirit, if not in letter. You know, like the French Connection deals with like actual Gladio. It's based on a story of how the French equivalent to the Gladio program was involved in heroin smuggling from Anatolia into Europe and eventually into the US. That was the French Connection, was how Corsican French mobsters imported the heroin. And I think that's super cool. We did an episode really early with our good friend James, who's coming on again in a couple days, hopefully, about the parallax view, which is a very weird movie from the 70s, sort of inspired by the early mythos of Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories. And a lot of deals with kind of just like knowing something is going on, but having this truth be just not beyond your grasp. You're knowing something's going on, but having this truth be just beyond your grasp. And as soon as you think you've uncovered something, you just have more questions than answers. Which I think, talking about parapolitics, like that's something that, that's whenever you ever try to investigate any of the really creepy, mysterious stuff in the 20th century, I think that anybody who knows what was going on back then is just trying to sell you something.
Sam, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, not really.
All right, so moving on to the post-Cold War era, there's a lot. So what are some of your favorites?
Another one, I think this is also Ridley Scott. He's coming up so often today. Another one with very bad politics, very like as reactionary as The Four Feathers, but a really good movie and a really important movie for understanding the modern world is Black Hawk Down. It's about what the U.S. Army was getting up to. I think the Army, maybe the Marines, I don't know, in Somalia in like 1997 or something. And it's in a lot of ways it's not trying to be, but it's very racist. It's very the depiction of Somalis is really unfortunate, but it completely set the tone aesthetically and politically for the war on terror, even though it came out like in like 2000, even before 9/11. And so that one movie like totally picks up on the cultural mood of like the next 10, 15 years, which I think is really interesting. And also something I think is kind of interesting, talking about if historical fiction has any kind of ethical obligation, this certainly fails any obligation it has, because it is a completely inaccurate depiction of what actually went down in Somalia. It paints the Somalis as just absolutely terrible, as monstrous barbarians, and depicts the American soldiers as heroes, even though the main character in the film, very shortly after the events of the film took place, would be arrested as a child molester. So it's a movie where like the main character is an actual pedophile, but it's so committed to this imperial project that it completely sanitizes that and has no problem making him the main character.
That's crazy that it came out before 9/11. I would have assumed that that's very interesting.
Such a 9/11 movie, like I know like Radiohead, like 35-year-old guys who always talk about how Radiohead's the best band. They're always telling you how it's amazing that Kid A came out before 9/11. That's how I feel with this movie.
Huh. Interesting. Sam, do you have any post-Cold War movies that come to mind?
Post-Cold War. I mean, it's one of those questions where it's like so broad that I can't even think of an answer, right?
Yeah.
I could try to narrow down. I mean,
Well,
if you want to mention,
I
Yeah.
can jump on one quick one. It's really bad, but it's really funny in how bad it is. Green Zone from like 2012, I think, with Matt Damon and with Brendan Gleeson. It's this movie where it's very interesting because it's about the CIA are like totally the good guys in this, and they're trying to stop the Department of Defense under George Bush from doing something bad in Iraq, like making some bad mistake. And so that kind of shows that's kind of this it came out in like 2012, but it kind of prefigures the politics of the Trump era, where the three-letter agencies are seen as professional and virtuous and beyond reproach, whereas the political appointees in the Department of Defense, those are the guys you can't trust. The CIA, though, they have everyone's best interest at heart. But the main reason, it's a terrible movie, but if you are going to watch it, there's really one reason to watch it, which is that Brendan Gleeson does the world's worst American accent. It's the worst accent I've ever heard. It makes Michael Caine in The Last Valley look like, he did the Stanislavski method. It's just amazing how bad he is. And this is from one of the best actors of our generation. It's hilarious.
Yeah. Well, okay. I have the Coen brothers on my mind because we just did one about one of their movies, but I mean, I'd have to say that
Burn After Reading?
no, I mean, that one is kind of questionable politically, but I gotta say it's definitely The Big Lebowski in many respects, just because it's like kind of this movie about like what are we even doing, because it's like literally like a couple of years after the end of the Cold War, America's the top honcho, and now there's just nothing really to do. So in a sense, we were all Lebowskis for a while, just trying to get into a bunch of weird hijinks to make sense of it all.
The dude abides. And what I think is interesting about The Big Lebowski is that it's from like 2001, but it's set earlier. It's set in like 1990. And at the time, I couldn't really figure out why that was, because you wouldn't know it's set in the early 90s. You'd think it was set like when it was made. But maybe they were really going for that whole like post-Cold War malaise kind of thing. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that's why it was 91, not 2001.
Yeah, that's a very interesting pick. I wouldn't have thought of that. All right, so last question I have for you guys. It's a hypothetical. If you were given like $200 million, make a movie about some historical event, what would you guys pick?
There's so much I'd love to do. Russian Sam, if you have any, I have a few, but if you have any ideas first, Sam.
Well, Liam's heard this idea before, but I would absolutely love to make like an anthology series about the Russian Civil War, where it's like each episode being a different theater, a totally different characters, totally unconnected, just with the connecting theme of all of these events take place during the Russian Civil War.
Yeah. Oh, that would be amazing. Yeah. No, that would be incredible. There's a few I have that I would not be the best person to make for like, cultural fluency reasons, because they're about places and times I'm just not familiar enough with. But I think that if I could give a different, or maybe a co-writer or a different director have a lot of this money, something could be good. Like I was thinking, you could make an amazing high-budget Netflix series about ancient Chinese history, where you get Chinese American actors speaking English to do like different episodes from the history of China. Like you start off in the early Bronze Age where it's like guys in chariots having clan arguments that are basically like the Northmen, but in China. Like I'd love that shit. And then you go into the Tang Dynasty and the Qing Dynasty with these like small self-contained stories. I think that would be an amazing miniseries. I also think, but for a movie, something I've thought could be really fun for a long time. It's such an obscure little story, but you could do so much fun with this. In the 9th and 10th century, famously, the era, the Moors, they invaded Spain. They had this beautiful flourishing of culture in Al-Andalus in Spain, but they also the Moors also attempted to settle in France, where they were defeated in like the 8th century by Charlemagne's dad, I want to say, or his like great grandfather.
Charles Martel.
Yeah, I can't remember their relationship. And people see that a lot of times it's seen as this like great, huge turning point in history. But historians kind of question how important that one battle was, because there actually was a Moorish presence in the south of France for a while after. And the longest lasting Moorish presence in France was this tiny castle called Froxenetum in like the bottom of France on the Mediterranean, uh, where for like 200 years, a skeleton crew of Arab pirates, or not just Arab, Muslim pirates from all around the world lived at this little castle, doing land and sea raids on passing merchants. And it was a thorn in the side of the French for like 200 years, and it was a thorn literally because the best defense this castle had was that they planted incredibly thorny brambles all around it, so there was no way to access the castle by land. There was like a secret passageway, like, it might have even been a secret tunnel that only these pirates knew. And for 200 years, they were just doing pirate stuff on land and on sea. They would like go all the way into the Alps and grab like pilgrims and help hold them for ransom. But it was always this super tiny crew of guys from like the fringes of the Muslim world. They were guys from Central Asia who were like running from their past. There were guys from Spain. They were like, I'm gonna guess there were probably some like, former noblemen who like lost out in some dynastic struggle trying to make a career there. So I think you could do a really fun pirate movie about these like early medieval Arab guys in this like feudal struggle to like they some of them were probably true believers that thought they could, spread the light of Islam to France. But really they were just trying to like get by taking hostages and stealing treasure wherever they could.
Yeah, that sounds super, super cool. Huh. Did not know about that. That's really interesting.
So Fraxinetum in ancient China. That's what I would give my money toward.
Okay, very
Hmm.
cool. Any other like last words you guys have?
Yeah, well, I'll just say this. This podcast has been a really fun part of my life for the last couple of years. Russian Sam, Sam B, Abram are all really great and fun people to work with. I've really enjoyed being part of this. It's really, we just started a Patreon, but it really is still just a hobby for us. But it's a really fun hobby that gives my life a lot more meaning. It gives me kind of a reason to study history more than just because it's fun. It kind of like it's really interesting just having these conversations with guests and with people that we are guests for, like yourself, and just having a reason to think about history and in particular historical fiction in a different way. In my more professional life, I am in the film industry in a very low level way. I would love to be involved in producing historical fiction, and I've realized through this podcast that people who make historical fiction do have certain responsibilities that other fiction does not entail. And I am much more aware of these responsibilities when I am constructing historical fiction than I would be in the past, basically just in what function is this serving in how people interpret the past. If you are depicting a time and place that people have no familiarity with, this is going to be this is going to be the basis of their fluency in that setting. So you do have this obligation to present that setting in a way that is responsible and I would say generally in a way that is historically accurate to the actual time itself.
Yeah, thank
Hmm.
you. Sam?
I guess I just like to quote Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. That book was written in like the 2nd century of the Common Era, I'd say, and yet, nevertheless, it still rings true. And if this was their perspective, nearly 2,000 years ago, then it just leaves you in a very very interesting place because at that point it's like, why even study history? Whereas for me, that's exactly why I study history, because I want to understand these patterns. I want to engage with the world in a deeper way, something beyond just my own life and my own experience. And even if I don't think it's necessarily always applicable to anything larger, I think that we can all become better people by becoming more engaged with history.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
and I think that trying to learn too much, I think that trying to draw like direct lessons from the past about the present can lead to some dangerous ends, or at least to be having a confused impression about the past and the present.
Mhm.
But I think that there is just so much that was so different about the past that gives you a lot to think about in many different ways. And then what I find especially what I like the most about learning about the past is finding the unexpected ways in that people in the past were similar to us in ways that they felt the same things that we feel, even if they were living in like second century BC Mesoamerica. People still
Mhm.
had basically the same, emotional arsenal that we've got. When people saw their children grow up and die, they were heartbroken, things like that. And yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe on a lighter note, I'm currently reading about the cult of saints in Catholicism, and there was
Mhm.
this really funny tidbit in there about how a lot of people looked upon saint days with some disdain because it was basically an opportunity for young people to, start pairing, basically, and having sex. And I was reading that today, and I was just
Yeah.
thinking, man, some things just never change.
Oh, yeah.
That's funny. And I think that's a great place to leave it. Liam, Sam, thank you so much for joining me today.
For
Thank you for having
sure.
us.
Thank you so much for having us on. And let me apologize. We are both terrible ramblers, and I hope it wasn't
No, this
too
was
much of a
very
pain for
fun. It was
you.
a very fun, very interesting conversation. If our listeners want more Gladio Free Europe, where can they find it?
We're everywhere. Spotify, Anchor, Apple Podcasts. Just look up Gladio Free Europe. I think we do now come up on the first page of Google results when you just search Gladio, but our full podcast name is Gladio Free Europe.
All right, great. Thank you. This has been So You Have a Podcast made by WXVU Radio. We will see you next time.